because I suppose what I'm talking about isn't really sort of multinational corporations and their engagement with sort of conflict environments, or really into, you know, or these kind of micro interactions between individuals, but it's kind of somewhere in the middle in terms of how people really try to manage in environments of conflict, just manage through them. So I suppose it's a slightly different frame. I've got lots and lots of photos. So that is a photo of sort of loyalist, what's called an enclave community in Belfast. And you've probably seen this. Probably seen this kind of this mural, a very famous mural. It actually relates to what I was just saying, the Battle of the Boyne, King William, kind of iconic figure in Northern Irish kind of unionism and loyalism. But you'll see that on the lamppost beside this kind of mural, and these murals demarcate the community. So you know when you're coming into the community that you're either welcome or you're not welcome in terms of what these do. They're signifiers. So you'll see the red, white, and blue kind of bunting on the thing, and then you'll see the Trump flag. Okay, which was really common in Belfast. So if you're wandering around these communities, if you're in loyalist communities, new unionist communities, you'll have seen this when we did a bit of a drive around. You'll see Israeli flags. You start seeing Trump flags. You know, sometimes you'll see other kind of American flags. If you're in Republican areas, you will see Palestinian flags. You'll see Basque flags. You'll see Catalonian flags. It's a kind of relatively new one, you know, but there is an identification with other conflict spaces as well, which is interesting. But I have to say the Trump thing, I just didn't think we could not draw attention to it because it's fantastic. So I suppose what I'm trying to do is to put a bit of a different frame on this type of work, you know, and to begin to think about why people who are interested in management and organizational studies more generally should be interested in conflict. And what I'm going to talk to you about just very quickly is just some of the stuff I did in a book that I wrote during COVID. And I wrote the book very quickly during COVID, just had to do something during COVID, I suppose, but also just because this was an area of work that I had been in professionally. So in a sense, the book was a sort of like an extrapolation of that work. And in that sense, it was kind of easier to do. Oh, there we go. Now, the other thing I suppose I want to talk about is how we frame this type of work within management and organizational studies more generally. I feel very strongly that you know, the idea of kind of business and peace management and peace, how these environments intersect, is quite difficult for people in management and business schools. They do not understand it. They do not like it. They do not think it is what they do. And so if we're going to be serious about this, and I think we should be serious about it because I think it's really, really important, then we have to sort of play ourselves into the game a bit. And these are some examples, I think, of people who have really played themselves into the game in terms of this type of work. So the work of kind of David Denyer, who spoke about yesterday, in terms of resilience. You know, this Snook's book on Friendly Fire, again, it deals with kind of resilience and risk, the management of risk in extreme contexts and high reliability organizations. Mark Durand's book, Doctors at War, I'm sure you're all familiar with. Mark Durand is a big player in what is called the extreme contexts literature. That's an extraordinary book where he kind of embedded himself with a load of medics in Afghanistan. You know, it's a very small book, but it's a really, really extraordinary read. And then this guy, I think I mentioned him last night, Haris Palovic, who is a Bosnian anthropologist who is working now in Australia, Bosnian refugee, someone who himself was a survivor of the camps during the Balkan Wars, and has written an extraordinary book from a sort of anthropological perspective called Places of Pain, that deals with the reality of the geographical management of commemoration, even when actually it isn't even commemoration, because there's still a sense of denial that it happened, you know, the sort of denial that's going on in the Balkans at the minute around things like Srebrenica, for example. So I think seeing really good examples of how you can do this and how people have done it, have engaged with conflict studies from other perspectives is helpful. You know, so whenever I look at this, I think about, you know, what is kind of relevant scholarship. And for me, relevant scholarship sits around the extreme context work. So, you know, Marcus Hallgrim, Mark Durand, who have really established that stream, established it within academic conferences, but also established a literature around it. That very seminal piece they published in Academy Management Review in terms of really setting up that area of work. Now, they don't really deal with conflict. That's the thing. They do extreme context, but extreme context for them is climbing Everest. Marcus Halgren's a big climber. So that's his idea, and that is an extreme context. But actually, the sort of stuff we're dealing with, is at another level, I think, entirely. And then there's this really interesting literature around grand challenges, kind of wicked problems, system-wide change, and there's a lot of work on that. I'm doing some work in that area at the minute, but there's a lot of really interesting leadership material there, so if you think about the work of someone like Heath Grint, who's been writing about wicked problems and the leadership practices and behaviors that help us disentangle wicked problems and move them on, I think is really important. And then, of course, we've got the business for peace literature that we're kind of all talking about kind of today as well. So, and then conflict studies, of course, more generally. So whenever I kind of think about my work, I like to make sort of distinctions in conflict types. I know we all do this to some extent. And one of the things that I've come across, particularly when I've been doing research in environments where you have had very significant conflicts arise, is that almost always at the beginning of those conflicts, people say the same thing. We thought it would be over really quickly. We thought it would just be a matter of days. 30 years later, people are saying, yeah, and it's still going. And that is a really kind of interesting thing, and that leads into a kind of crisis response. And then you have this process of transitioning into much more long-term conflict, which then leads to transitioning into institutional and organizational processes to manage that kind of long-term conflict. And I think that is a really interesting thing, which is massively understudied, I believe, as well. And then what are the kind of organizational behaviors and practices that result from this process of institutionalization? Just to give you, I suppose, a bit of background, this picture, I don't know if anyone recognizes this picture. This is, I don't know why all these pictures are Northern Ireland, but there's a picture of an incident called the murder of the two corporals. And so there was a very dreadful 10 days, probably the worst 10 days in Northern Ireland's history, in the late 1980s. Yeah, where you'll remember what was called the murder, the killings on the Rock. Okay, so 3 IRA members go to Gibraltar to try to bomb a British Army installation in Gibraltar. They then are shot by an SAS unit who are clearly tracking them. They're unarmed when they're shot, which created a sort of load of controversy around that. Their bodies are flown back to Dublin a few days later. The bodies then come back to Northern Ireland. They are buried in Milltown Cemetery, where the hunger strikers are buried. There is an attempt by a loyalist paramilitary called Michael Stone to bomb the funeral. So he arrives with hand grenades, a couple of guns, shoots up the funeral, throws a few bombs. There are 3 more people killed at the funeral. I kid you not, this all happened over like 3 or 4 days. And then at the funeral of one of those people who were killed, so the funeral of one of the people who was killed in the graveyard, these 2 British Army corporals, and it is not entirely clear yet what they were doing. They seem to either get lost or got too close, but ended up somehow within the confines of the funeral. And I think realistically probably panicked. In fairness, I can't really blame them, and pulled a gun. And that was the end of that. They were dead. And so this is this was a funeral which had masses, because of the events leading up to it, had massive amount of press there. Literally dozens and dozens of photographers. There were helicopters overhead who were filming the funeral as well. So these 2 guys, this is the point at which they're being dragged out of the car. They're dragged out of the car. They're taken to waste ground over that fence you'll see in the background, beaten to death and shot. And there's a much more graphic, also much more famous photo, which I don't use anymore because I actually don't think it's ethical to use it, of them lying dead on the ground, being given the last rites by a man called Alec Reid, who was one of the people that brokered the IRA ceasefires in the end. So these are extremely, and this is really 20 years into the Northern Ireland conflict. This is not the really hot conflict you had in the early 1970s. We're way into it at this point. So, and the fact that this is now institutionalized to the extent that the murders of those 2 guys is not just on camera, but on hundreds of cameras, everybody, the footage, thank goodness, has never been shown, but I'm sure it's around, I'm sure people have seen it. So, these are incredibly difficult kind of processes to engage in. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of an insight into some of the sort of some of the comments just in the research that I've done. And most of that research looks at sort of SMEs, so sort of small business owners, people who have tried to find, build and develop businesses in environments, Northern Ireland, in the Basque region, and in Bosnia post-war were the kind of context that I looked at. And this was again a guy, he's very famous hotel owner in Northern Ireland now, but he talked about this awful period at the beginning when he founded his first bar, and this idea that they had a door that squeaked, and so every time the door opened it squeaked, and he really, every single time the door squeaked, he thought he was going to be shot, because he was trying to hold out in the way that we spoke about earlier in terms of things like protection money. He was trying to adhere to a certain set of practices in relation to his bar, that he didn't want paramilitaries in it, he didn't want to play the national anthem at night, he didn't want to attract trouble in certain ways, and he took a stand. But the physical reality of that was living in, as he says, the first year was just like hell. That's what it was like. And he ended up getting stabbed actually just after the first year. So he was in a very difficult situation. And then I feel very strongly that one of the ways that we can make this a much more mainstream endeavor is that we can begin to look at it from different theoretical perspectives and different lenses. And again, this is someone extraordinary man who we interviewed in Sarajevo. His name is Ismet Kumalik. He was a sort of a company director in the former Yugoslavia before the wars. He then became the civilian administrator of Dobrinja. You can look him up. There's quite a lot about him online. And Dobrinja was the bit in Sarajevo that was the newly built athletes village for, if you remember, the Sarajevo Olympics not that long before the war. So Dobrinja is this incredibly cool up and running place that and it was full of doctors, lawyers, academics, and they became almost entirely cut off. And they dug something like 30 miles of tunnels between buildings just to allow people to move freely, because obviously, they were entirely surrounded and they were getting picked off by snipers and blast bombs almost continually, So but then post-war, he went on to find a series of banks from the Bosnia. He's an economist. And he spoke actually about the leadership challenges. So the leadership challenges of leading a community through what was a really almost unbelievable, almost unimaginable level of stress and difficulty and danger. And then going back to an organization and having to lead people, in a so-called normal organization again. And he talked about this. He drew this inverted pyramid for us. And he said, when we think about organizations, a lot of the time you're still thinking about this pyramid idea. You've got the person at the top, the leader at the top, and people through it. But whenever you're in situations of crisis, when you're in real difficulty, the pyramid becomes inverted. You're now at the bottom, you're carrying them in your shoulders. And so he talked in great detail just about the leadership practices that were incredibly important for him in relation to that as well. And then I think another kind of lens which can be used to look at this, and I know a lot of people have done it already, and I've written quite a bit on this, is just the management of space, how you manage space in conflicted environments, just the difficulties of managing space, how you manage those kind of conflict processes, formal and informal boundaries, interfaces between communities, visible interfaces, invisible interfaces, and how that becomes institutionalized within public management. This is a public management challenge as well as it's a conflict transformation challenge, because these seep into processes and practices around public management. And the fact that most of these spaces are liminal spaces, that's a picture of the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, which itself is an incredibly interesting story in terms of how you regenerate a community and a city in the midst of conflict. So the day before the Guggenheim was opened, there was a policeman killed in a bomb attack just on those steps, you know. So you know, an extremely kind of difficult process, and how you manage as the business, you know, as the business community in Bilbao managed to do, because of course there was no international money that went into the Guggenheim. There was no international money that went into the train system in Bilbao. There was no international money that went into the idea of putting art and sculpture at the very center of the city. It was all local money. They paid for it themselves. And they paid for it themselves because the Spanish state did not recognize that there was conflict, which is the big difference in this kind of environment as well. So I think this idea of kind of liminal space and you know, a lot of these environments kind of sitting in kind of liminal space, you know, and then also the management of memory, you know, how we deal with memory, how we deal with the past, how people sense make around this. And we have a paper under review at the minute using a sort of sense making lens to look at how commemorative communities, so groups of people who were set up to commemorate particular atrocities, how they manage that process of sense making and then coming together as different communities, you know, and that is very much kind of bound up as well with place-based leadership. And one of the things I think we know now about environments coming out of conflict is that dealing with the past is often the greatest challenge. So if we look at Spain at the minute, you know, Spain is still going through an incredibly difficult process post-Civil War. You know, they're only dealing with the legacy of Franco. They're digging people up, they're burying other people, they're changing laws. Right now in Spain, still dealing with the legacy, you know, of something that happened 70 years ago. So it doesn't just kind of go away. And that is an organizational process as well as a political process. So this is a very particular picture for today. Obviously, Ulster is British, no surrender. That is kind of where Northern Ireland really is at the minute, you know, so that's probably the best representation of where we are. So I suppose my basic premise in this is that it goes beyond business, you know, that we have to take it beyond business, that organizational activity is incredibly important, that peace building is an organizational process in the same way that it is a political process and a community process. I talk a bit about kind of peace building entrepreneurship, even though I'm really not someone who deals with entrepreneurship, you know, so I'm sort of cautious to be saying too much about it. And the way I kind of define peace building entrepreneurship as this idea of organizational activity, which seeks to build peace in environments of conflict. And whenever, you know, I'm kind of talking about that, I am talking about organizational actors that are situated in these environments and that are actively pursuing opportunities to build peace. And then what I tried to do was to look at the particular practices that allowed people, particularly in these kind of three locations of the Basque country, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Northern Ireland, what were the kind of what were the practices that allowed people to be able to do that? And so I came up with these four practices, which I thought were common to each of the environments, and I think go beyond those environments. I think they're, you know, they can be seen in other environments of conflict and transition as well. So, and this is where we had a lot of text, okay, loads and loads of text. So you see, I thought it was kind of okay because you had so much serious text in your previous slides. And so,
you still have a picture though.
Yeah, I've still got the text and the pictures, which is kind of crazy. So, yeah, and the picture, there's a lot of text. It's all right. This is the picture of sort of a local paper. Again, I'm not sure why all these are Northern Ireland slides. I usually hardly ever have them, but this was very famous kind of cover the main local newspaper the day of the first IRA ceasefire, you know, and that was a really, I can tell you, a really iconic day. And most people, of course, then, you know, 1996 found out through the newspaper, like, because the newspaper used to be sold in the afternoon, and this is how most people found out the IRA called a ceasefire, you know. And it was I remember being in a bus station in Belfast and people were literally standing around just in shock, you know. It was a huge kind of event. So the first kind of practice that I came around actually really goes to the very heart of this, you know, this kind of social commitment to conflict transformation. You know, people who are working in the allocation of public housing, people who were developing businesses, you know, refugees who were reinvesting in Bosnia, you know, who had left Bosnia as refugees, who have built businesses in Canada or Germany or Australia, coming back, investing back in their home villages. You know, when you spoke to them, they were able to demonstrate a real personal commitment to conflict transformation. It wasn't just about making money. It wasn't just about kind of getting on. It was actually about transforming the conflict, you know. And you also had this very important issue of fear and courage. You know, this takes an enormous amount of courage. It is not something that people can engage in lightly, because if you're trying to build a business in an environment where you're putting yourself on the line again and again and again, you have to have that courage, and you have to also acknowledge the level of fear that's there as well. You know, and so this idea that whether you're talking about SMEs or you're talking about public managers who are involved in the delivery of services, or you're talking about voluntary organizations, you have people who are genuinely committed in terms of what they're doing. And that commitment is a long running commitment. It's something that goes on for a long time. And then, you know, I think this is probably the most sort of interesting finding, was just the extraordinary level of political skill with which these people were working. So they understood their environment incredibly well. Their tacit knowledge about the background of the environment was absolutely extraordinary. You know, I spoke earlier about this famous incident with this gift to Ian Paisley, and I think it probably also says quite a bit about the individuals who were involved, because the Irish diplomats who kind of orchestrated this incredibly emotive gift really got it. They really got it. They'd been in that game for a long time. They really, really understood it in a way that perhaps their equivalents in the Northern Ireland office didn't, just because of the churn. You know, there's just a lot more churn within that organization. So, you know, this idea of kind of political skill seemed to be incredibly important, because people are exercising sort of intra-organizational dexterity in order to be able to innovate in extraordinary ways. You know, people who are really managing, you know, people talked about managing in the fissures that they were able to create between communities, and to sense make constantly and to develop situational awareness about what they were doing in terms of those organizational processes. And then, you know, there was also this idea of the need to be able to exercise professional and expert or positional capital. You know, so people were looking at what they could do, where they could define themselves sometimes, you know, as honest brokers, you know, so they were basing a lot of their activity on their own reputations for integrity, you know, so the idea that personal integrity was incredibly important, particularly in the accessing of elites. And when I mean the accessing of elites, I'm not just talking about political elites, I'm talking about paramilitary elites, you know, that if you're able to sort of get in and talk to people who are absolutely engaged in those really difficult, down and dirty kind of conversations. And very often you saw people who were able to cultivate throughout their entire careers a genuine reputation for independence, you know, that they had an independent thought, which I'll tell you, in a divided society, whether it's Bosnia or whether it's Northern Ireland or whether it's the Basque region, is incredibly difficult. You know, that requires a level of political skill which is not common.
Yeah.
So then the kind of last, the last thing was this idea of the sort of cultivation and management of networks of support. Sometimes those networks of support were international, you know, so you one of the things that's interesting is that you have a lot of international networks between people who are operating within these environments. Museums, for example, you know, museum curators who are, you know, managing collections in Northern Ireland are very much in touch with museum curators in the Basque Country, who are very much in touch with people in Bosnia, who are trying to navigate incredibly difficult political dynamics, you know. And so what you see are people who are operating at the intersection, I suppose what we would call multiple institutional fields, and they're using, you know, their ability to agitate for change in those fields right at the kind of intersection of one institutional field with another, and then being able to sort of, you know, to use their tacit and explicit knowledge of these networks to create change that sometimes colleagues who were less motivated and less committed, didn't have the same level of access to. So in a sense, the networks of support themselves become mutually reinforcing, and you see you also saw these people sort of generate careers through organizations that, became incredibly important. I think that's it. Yeah, so that's it. So really, that is a very sort of quick run through my book. So you don't have to read the book. It makes it much easier. There's obviously more in the book, but it's just a very kind of quick analysis of maybe how people do this. First of all, how we can look at these things in a slightly different way that, God forbid, might make us a bit more publishable, more broadly publishable, because that is always a challenge realistically in academia. And then also why this work, goes beyond business. It has to go beyond business. And I think that is something which is really under-researched. Some of the same principles apply, but it's not the same way.